Chapter 1. The 6-second threshold. The diagnostic display on Marcus's terminal blinked in a steady, rhythmic amber. It was the exact color of the Venusian atmospheric arrays he had studied during his fellowship. A warm, artificial light meant to mimic a sun. Humanity hadn't properly stood under for 3 centuries. The magnetic lattice is holding at 99.8%, Marcus said, his voice echoing slightly in the cramped confines of the test pod. But the decay curve isn't waiting for us, Dante. We've lost another 3 milligrams of the fluorovium-116 stock since the morning briefing. Marcus mopped his frizzy hair back over his head. His hair may look like he forgot it existed. It still managed to get in his way sometimes. Marcus was not someone you would call put together. Tall and thin, with worn clothes that were more functional rather than presentable. Marcus usually left a general impression of someone whose attention was directed somewhere just past the immediate moment. From the crawl space beneath the main deck, a metallic clang signaled Dante Hall's frustration. The engineer emerged backward, wiping gray synthetic grease from his forearm onto an already ruined jumpsuit. Unlike Marcus, Dante was broad-shouldered and compact, with a build earned through consistent, purposeful exercise rather than vanity. He stands shorter than most of his peers, which is an advantage in his line of work. Long brown hair is kept in a practical ponytail during work shifts. If Earth's steering committee had their way, we'd spend another 6 months running automated simulations until the entire Oort rock decays into useless lead, Dante grunted, tossing a torque driver into its magnetic rack. The NRBM gave us the green light precisely because this batch has a 1-month fuse. We use it or we lose it. Sora, tell me the thruster alignment is green so I can stop looking at these plumbing schematics. At the front of the pod, framed by the reinforced glance shield that looked out into the absolute black of the outer solar system, Sora didn't look back. Her hands danced across the reaction control system, RCS, toggles with the effortless rhythm of someone who had logged 10,000 hours pulling freighters between the Jovian moons. RCS is locked, Dante. Pitch and yaw are calibrated to the Oort station's beacon, Sora said. Her tone was level, entirely devoid of the anxiety currently twisting Marcus's stomach into knots. Relax. If the slipstream collapses, we won't live long enough to hear Earth say, "I told you so." Marcus watched the back of her pilot's chair, tracing the clean line of her shoulders down from the headrest. In the 3 years since the start of building the fluorovium pods, she had been the practical anchor to his math. He had rewritten the spatial tensor equations 40 times, just to ensure her flight profile had a 5% safety margin. He wanted to tell her that, wanted to explain exactly how many sleepless nights on the Neptune base had been spent calculating the precise pressure her specific piloting style would exert on the localized quantum slipstream. Sora smiled at him, waiting a short moment for him to laugh at her joke. Sora was a tall woman of mixed Asian or Caucasian origin, shaped by years of long-haul piloting in confined spacecraft. Her sharp, observant dark eyes moved away from him back to her consoles, spinning her short black hair she almost always wore pinned up, a practical habit carried over from years of working in zero-gravity environments. Her movements on the console were economical and deliberate. Instead of smiling at Sora's black humor, Marcus cleared his throat and adjusted the view on his data slate. "Let's see if we can replicate the drone test fluke," he said, playfully referring to how many of his colleagues on Earth were still unable to explain how the Neptune research project was able to zip drones around the solar system at FTL speeds. "A fluke is just physics too complex for those dense pigeonheads back on Earth," Sora replied, briefly glancing back over her chair again. She caught his eye, offering a faint, sharp smile. "Right, Professor?" "Right," Marcus managed, looking down at his monitors to avoid looking into her auburn eyes for slightly too long. The microdrones we shifted across the Jupiter-Saturn lane last week showed a total transit time of exactly 0 seconds relative to the payload, he said. The only delay is the communication feedback loop across light seconds. For us, inside the bubble, the shift should be instantaneous. We are targeting a coordinates jump exactly 3 light minutes out toward the Kuiper perimeter. 3 light minutes, Dante muttered, buckling himself into the tertiary tech seat. Far enough to prove a human brain doesn't liquefy when space folds. Close enough that if the comms still work, we can call home for a ride back. The pod's central console chimed, a high, clear tone that cut through the low hum of the life support systems. The automated countdown from the Oort synthesis station was transferring to their main display. T-minus 5 minutes to shift ignition. Marcus felt the weight of the moment press down on him. For centuries, humanity had built a solar empire on sublight mechanics. They had hollowed out asteroids, spun up orbital habitats around Mars and Venus, and built military and research bases on the moons of all the gas giants, and now even in the Kuiper belt. They were masters of endurance, shackled only by the stubborn vacuum of a periodic table that lacked the super-heavy elements needed to cheat Einstein's speed limit. Now, a single unstable isotope of flerovium, mined from a very unique dead rock at the edge of the humanity's reach, was about to untether them. Initiating final reactant feed, Dante said, his banter dropping away into professional focus. Flerovium 116 injection matrix is online. Magnetic containment is stabilizing at maximum yield. Pod steering is decoupled from the station, Sora announced, her fingers hovering over the main ignition sequence. We are on internal power. Marcus, final word on the spatial gradient? Marcus checked the primary monitor one last time. The quantum slipstream equations, his equations, were green across the board. The tunnel entry vector is clean. If the theory holds, we won't feel a thing. Let's hope your theory likes us, Sora said softly. Her hand settled on the master engagement switch. Locking harnesses. See you on the other side of the fence. Marcus gripped the armrests of his station, his gaze locked on the countdown timer as it ticked into the final 10 seconds. His mind wasn't on the accolades, or the furious protests from Earth's safety board, or the vast empire this technology would build. It was on the slightly shaky profile of Sora in her pilot chair, silhouetted against the stars, and the hope that they would both be alive to see those stars again in a few fleeting moments. Sora's hand came down on the master engagement switch. Marcus expected a jolt, or perhaps the artificial tug of their chairs, struggling to soften a sudden acceleration. Instead, reality simply unspooled. For a fraction of a second that felt simultaneously like an eternity and a non-moment, Marcus ceased to be a passive observer behind a data slate. The rigid boundaries of his own mind dissolved. He didn't feel pain, but rather a profound, disorienting expansion, as if his consciousness had been stretched across a vast, cosmic grid of choices. He was a math equation waiting to be resolved, a cloud of infinite possibilities existing in every corner of the solar system at once. It was the physical manifestation of a wave function, waiting for a final measurement to lock it into place. Then, with the sharp, clean snap of a closing static charge, reality slammed shut. Marcus gasped, his lungs burning as if he had forgotten how to breathe. The cramped, familiar geometry of the test pod solidified around him, but the quiet amber glow of the diagnostic terminals was gone. The console was a chaotic sea of flashing crimson. A harsh, pulsed audio alert began to chime from the main deck. "Report!" Dante yelled from his harness, his hands already flying across the environmental overrides. "Sensors are tanking. The hull temp is spiking on the starboard flank." Marcus forced his vision to focus on his primary slate. The targeted coordinates for the Kuiper belt perimeter were entirely blank. The telemetry wasn't registering the low-energy background of the solar system's edge. "We aren't in the Kuiper belt," Marcus said, his voice strained as he fought the lingering vertigo of the transition. The spatial gradient, it didn't overshoot. It completely broke vector. He looked up, past the main console, through the reinforced glance shield. He could see only the dark of space from his viewpoint far back in the cockpit, but he could see the reflection of a reddish light as it bounced off the profile of Sora's face. On the right side of their cockpit windows was a colossal, churning wall of amber, ochre, and violent, cream-colored storms. Swirling bands of high-velocity gas stretched out across thousands of kilometers, moving with a silent, terrifying momentum. "Jupiter," Sora whispered. Her hands were locked onto the thruster assembly, but her fingers were trembling. "We're in the inner Jovian system." "Worse," Marcus muttered, his fingers typing furiously to interpret the radiation telemetry. "We are tucked inside the inner magnetosphere, just past the orbit of Amalthea. The radiation flux here is throwing off our external arrays. The pod's light shielding wasn't built for the Jovian belts. We have less than 40 minutes before the electronics start frying from high-energy electrons." "How the hell did we end up at Jupiter?" Dante roared, unbuckling his harness and dropping heavily into the deck crawl space. The nav computer was locked to the Oort beacon. It's mechanically impossible for the drift to be this severe. "The nav computer didn't fail," Marcus said, looking over at Sora. She was staring to her right out a window, seeing the massive planet below them, her face pale under the harsh red emergency lights. The system executed the wave function collapse perfectly. It just chose the wrong target. Before he could process the theoretical implications of the destination, Dante's voice came crackling through the deck intercom. "Marcus, forget the geography lesson. We have a fatal fuel leak. The fluorovium injection manifold didn't just meter out a microgram catalyst. The whole system experienced a massive, uncalculated feedback surge during the shift. The containment field had to brute force the stabilization." Marcus felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. "What's the volume, Dante?" "We are down to 7.2% of our fluorovium 116 stock," Dante stated flatly. 90% of our fuel is gone, vanished into the quantum slipstream, and what's left is sitting in a warped feed line that's heating up. If the temperature in that line hits 300 Kelvin, the remaining fluorovium will destabilize and drop its half-life from a month to a microsecond. We'll be an expanding cloud of radioactive dust before the radiation even cooks us. Sora finally tore her eyes away from the giant planet outside. She recovered herself and applied the cold, calculating focus of a veteran pilot. "Can we shift out on 7%? "Theoretically, yes, for a short jump," Marcus said, his mind racing through the mathematical adjustments. "But not with a warped manifold. If we try to inject the fluorovium while the feed lines are misaligned, the quantum tunnel will collapse mid-transit, shearing the pod in half." "Then we fix it," Sora said, her voice dropping into a low, steady register. "Dante, bypass the primary injection loop. Route the magnetic containment directly into the secondary backup valves. Then—" He interrupted her. "Already on it. Know what I'm doing." "Okay," said Sora. "Marcus, I need you out of that seat and down in the maintenance well assisting him. I'll use the RCS thrusters to keep our nose angled away from the primary radiation stream, but every second we spend here, our systems are degrading." Marcus unbuckled his harness, his limbs feeling heavy and uncoordinated. As he lowered himself into the tight, grease-slicked crawl space next to Dante, his mind kept looping back to that brief, infinite moment during the shift. He remembered the feeling of boundless possibility, and he remembered the sudden, sharp image of Jupiter's bands that had flashed across his mind just before they snapped back into physical reality. He glanced up through the deck, grating at Sora. Her jaw was set, her eyes locked on the navigational telemetry of the Jovian moons she had spent her youth navigating. Chapter 3. Mechanical Tolerance. Hold the collar steady, Marcus. If that magnetic alignment shifts by even 0.5 millimeter, the plasma stitcher will slice right through the secondary containment line. Marcus braced his boots against the structural ribs of the pod's underbelly, his muscles cramping from the prolonged strain. Sweat dripped into his eyes, stinging and blurring his vision, but he didn't dare release his grip on the heavy titanium collar. Through his insulated work gloves, he could feel the deep, frantic hum of the failing fuel system. Directly opposite him in the narrow crawl space, Dante face-shielded against the bright blue glare of the stitcher. The engineer was working with a methodical, desperate speed. Above them, the ship's hull groaned as the intense magnetic field of Jupiter caught the pod's outer framework, inducing parasitic electrical currents throughout the metal skin. The radiation alarm had shifted from a rhythmic chime to a continuous, flat tone. "Bypass is locked," Dante panted, flipping up his visor and instantly reaching for a manual pressure gauge. The secondary valves are holding the flerovium 116 matrix, but the flow rate is dangerously restricted. The warped line is choking the feed. We've got enough structural integrity for exactly 1 ignition cycle before the thermal bloom destroys the entire manifold. Marcus carefully slid his hands away from the collar, checking his wrist slate. The radiation flux is accelerating. We've already taken 3 millisieverts. Non-essential systems on the upper deck are starting to cycle reboot. Then we don't have time to calibrate a manual flight path. Sora's voice cut through the deck speaker, taut and fast. The primary navigation, HUD, just fuzzed out into static. I've lost visual on the Jovian horizon. Marcus, get up here. We need a vector now. Marcus scrambled up the maintenance ladder, wiping his grease-stained hands on his trousers. The main cabin was a chaotic landscape of flickering displays. The massive shape of Jupiter still dominated the glance shield, but the edges of the view were blurring with violet static as high-energy electrons bombarded the outer layers of the glass. "We can't risk a manual coordinate entry," Marcus said, dropping into his seat and immediately tethering his data slate to the main console. "The radiation is introducing bit flips into the primary flight computer's memory banks. If we enter the spatial tensors manually, a single corrupted decimal point will drop us inside Jupiter's core." Sora looked at him, her hands hovering above the dead navigation screen. "What's the alternative? We can't stay here." "We let the automated navigation model take complete control of the system," Marcus said, tapping a sequence to override the pilot input protocols. "The shipboard vector engine, it doesn't rely on live sensor telemetry that can be corrupted by radiation. It runs on a closed, highly advanced probabilistic matrix. It will analyze our remaining fuel volume, calculate the exact degradation rate of the flerovium, and select the closest stable gravity well outside this radiation zone." "You want to let an advanced logic model drive the shift engine?" Dante asked, climbing out of the hatch and buckling into his seat. "It's not a pilot, Marcus. It's just a massive collection of spatial algorithms." "Exactly," Marcus said, his fingers locking in the command strings. "It doesn't panic, it doesn't hesitate, and its processing core is triple shielded against localized radiation. It treats the entire solar system as a pure mathematical probability space. It will find the path of least resistance." Sora hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes scanning the failing instruments, then nodded. "Do it. Hand it over." Marcus slammed his hand onto the authorization pad. On the central console, the flashing red alerts vanished, replaced by a clean, monochrome interface. The shipboard vector engine didn't speak, nor did it display a countdown. Instead, millions of lines of raw positional data began to stream across the screens at a speed human eyes couldn't follow. The system was tokenizing the entire local volume of space, discarding trillions of unsafe vectors within milliseconds. The ship's automated voice synthesizer issued a flat, tonal notification. Optimal egress vector established. Destination: Saturn Orbital Hub Sector, Clearance Zone Delta 4. Initializing reactant injection. Down in the deck plates, the secondary manifold screamed as the remaining flerovium-116 was forced through the restricted bypass valves. The pod shivered violently. "Containment holding at 7%, Dante shouted over the noise. "It's feeding! Do it now." The AI model executed the ignition sequence. The transition was entirely unlike the first jump. There was no disorienting expansion of consciousness, no lingering sensation of boundless choices, and no mental imagery. It was a cold, clinical, and instantaneous translation of mass. 1 millisecond, they were being bombarded by the violent, amber glare of Jupiter's storms. The next, the pod fell completely silent. The violent shaking stopped. The flat tone of the radiation alarm cut out, leaving only the quiet, steady hum of the backup life support systems. Marcus blinked, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked out forward through the cockpit windows. Far in the background, the serene golden rings of Saturn hung suspended against a clean field of unchanging stars. The pod was drifting peacefully in empty space, exactly where the navigation model had predicted. "We're out," Sora whispered, her hands dropping from the controls as she slumped back into her seat with a deep exhale. The vector worked perfectly. Dante checked his engineering terminal, a look of profound relief washing over his face. The fuel line didn't blow. The remaining flerovium is stable at 0.6% volume. We're running on sublight auxiliaries now, but we are well within range of the Saturn hub's rescue beacons. Marcus stared at the monochrome display of the ship's navigation model, which was already quietly shutting down its high-performance processing cores. The shift had been flawless, precise, and entirely predictable, exactly like the early drone tests. Chapter 4. Residual Data. The observation lounge of the Ch1-4 orbital habitat offered a view that money usually couldn't buy, but a near-fatal FTL mishap apparently secured the best seats in the house. Through the massive, curved polycarbonate floor, the golden expanse of Saturn's B ring unfurled like the endless grooves on a vinyl record. Marcus swirled the synthetic vegetable soup in his bowl, watching the dark silhouette of their recovered test pod docked in the maintenance bay 3 levels below. It looked remarkably intact for a vessel that had accidentally brushed the shadow of Jupiter. "I don't think incompetent was the word Director Vance used," Dante said, breaking the silence. He was lounging across a low-gravity sofa, a fresh medical patch stuck to his neck to counteract the mild radiation exposure. "I believe the exact phrase was reckless, unauthorized trajectory deviation bordering on criminal negligence." Sora let out a dry laugh from the edge of the viewport, her flight jacket slung over the back of her chair. It's hard to tell. By the time his transmission traveled from Neptune to Saturn, 3 hours had passed. Trying to defend ourselves was completely pointless. We'd send a data block explaining the fuel manifold warp, and 3 hours later, we'd just get another video of him turning purple and pounding his desk. It wasn't a debrief, it was a delayed monologue. "He's terrified Earth will pull the NRBM synthesis funding," Marcus said quietly. He hadn't touched his drink. His gaze was still fixed on the pod below, his mind running through a loop of data logs that didn't make any mathematical sense. Sora leaned forward, her sharp gray eyes catching his profile. "Marcus, you've barely said 10 words since the medical team cleared us. Your head stuck in crawl space?" Marcus blinked, pulling himself back to the lounge. "No, I'm here. I'm just trying to reconcile the telemetry. We're alive. The pod is back. And we proved flerovium can shift biological matter without turning our organs inside out," Dante said, shrugging. "That's a win in any engineering log." But how did we move? Marcus asked with exasperation, turning to face them. That's what's frying my brain. During that first shift, right when you hit the switch, Sora, did either of you feel it? Dante's posture shifted, his easygoing demeanor fading slightly. He sat up, rubbing his thumb against his palm. The unspooling. Yeah. I didn't want to say anything to the medtechs because I didn't want them pinning a psychological red flag on my file. But it felt like my consciousness was being dragged through a sieve, like I was a cloud of dust scattered across the whole system all at once. Exactly, Marcus said, a chill running down his spine as Dante confirmed it. A complete dissolution of localized perspectives. The boundaries of my brain's electrical matrix seemed to expand into the entire probability space of the quantum tunnel. It was exactly what the wave function equations look like on paper before they collapse into a single state. He looked over at Sora, waiting for her nod. Instead, Sora just frowned, looking between the two of them with genuine confusion. I have no idea what you two are talking about. It felt like a standard high G translation to me. A bit of a stomach drop when the inertial dampeners lagged, sure, but that was it. My head stayed exactly where it always is. Marcus stared at her, his internal theories suddenly veering into uncharted territory. You didn't feel the expansion? At all? No, Sora said firmly. I was too busy watching the telemetry lines drop. Which brings us back to the real puzzle, Dante interjected, tapping his fingers on his knee. Why did the first jump miss by hundreds of millions of kilometers? We spent 3 weeks verifying those Kuiper perimeter coordinates. The math was pristine, yet we ended up deep inside Jupiter's magnetosphere. Then, an hour later, with a choked fuel line and zero preparation, the ship's basic vector AI drops us exactly into the Saturn Delta IV clearance zone down to the kilometer. It doesn't make sense. Marcus went silent, the pieces of a terrifyingly elegant puzzle starting to click together in the back of his mind. He thought about the automated drones, the ones that could shift out perfectly based on their last programmed input, but became completely inert and unable to activate their return drives until a human signal from a research station re-established light-speed contact. He had assumed it was an information lag issue, a mechanical quirk of the dark space. But what if the fluorovium drive didn't just require a mathematical coordinate? What if the super-heavy element's ability to collapse a massive quantum wave function across space required a definitive, conscious observer to lock the destination into reality? The shipboard AI had no consciousness. It was a closed system of pure, unfeeling algorithms. It didn't possess a mind to scatter across a probability space, so it simply executed the mathematical vector exactly as programmed. But humans were different. I don't know, Sora said, standing up and stretching her arms. She looked back out at the rings of Saturn, her expression softening with a hint of nostalgia. Maybe we just got lucky on the second one. Honestly, during that first countdown, staring at those empty Kuiper belt coordinates, my head was all over the place. It was scary, knowing you pilot a machine that could theoretically go anywhere you wanted, while you can't see where you're going. But when the alarm started screaming at Jupiter, the adrenaline kicked in, and I knew what to do to get out of there. She picked up her jacket, tossing it over her shoulder with a faint smile. Still, Marcus mumbled, I feel like we got lucky. I just relied on muscle memory, she added casually, as she walked toward the exit corridor. I spent 5 years hauling helium-3 through the Jovian lanes when I was younger. I know my approach vectors in and out of the Jupiter system. It's like a second nature to me. See you guys at the morning briefing. The automated door hissed shut behind her. Marcus froze, his drink entirely forgotten, as a cold spike of adrenaline hit his chest. He realized something. Maybe she was visualizing the Jovian cargo lanes even before the shift happened. A habit. At the exact moment the wave function was supposed to collapse into an empty patch of the Kuiper belt, the pilot, the only conscious mind at the ship's controls, who hadn't been disoriented by the shift's psychological echo, could have been reminiscing about Jupiter. Marcus was realizing a terrifying new truth. The Flerovium drive didn't just care about mapped coordinates. It cared about who was looking and where they wanted to go.